everyone, and welcome to another episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Allie Roden, and I'm the digital media producer here at Seed World Group. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to be your host. Last week on Seed Speaks, you heard PhD students talk about their work, why it's significant, why they wanted to be in plant science, and their advice for how up-and-coming young science students can be successful in plant science. This week, we're addressing the importance of wild crop relatives in plant breeding. To help us learn more, we've got three fantastic panelists joining us. Barbara Hellier, horticulture crops and beta curator with the Western Regional Plant Introduction Station, Pat Byrne, plant geneticist in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences at Colorado State University, and Alan Humphries, curator of the Australian Pastures Genebank. We're going to hear from Alan in a short pre-recorded video as he was unable to attend today's live stream. But before we hear from Alan, let's start with some introductions. Can you tell us more about yourself, Patrick?
Yes, well, I'm a semi-retired plant breeder and geneticist. I've worked mostly with corn and wheat, a little bit with canola, and have always been fascinated by looking at less adapted materials, wild relatives and land races as sources of good genes for plant breeding. Most recently, I'm involved in producing educational materials on these topics. So glad to be with you today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pat. And Barbara, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
So I'm the one of the curators at the Pullman Plant Introduction Station, the Western Regional Plant Introduction Station. We're part of the National Plant Germplasm System. It's a and I curate several collections. The beet collection, so that includes sugar beets, table beets, chard, fodder beets, lettuce, and allium. So I am responsible for the collections of all the alliums except for onion and bunching onion. And then I have a wide mix of other species, genera, from minor forage legumes to some medicinals, some ornamentals, and some herbs. Crop wild relatives are a big part of all of these collections, and they're an important part. They've been they're one of the most challenging groups to manage, but they've also been some of the most interesting material to work with.
Thank you, Barbara. Now, before I ask Pat and Barbara some questions, I'm going to play my conversation with Alan to kick off the discussion.
Alan, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you give me and the audience a short introduction on yourself and what your current role is?
Yeah, hi, Allie. It's great to be here. So, Alan Humphries. I'm a scientist at SARDI in South Australia, and my role covers a fairly broad range of activities from conservation of plant genetic resources. I curate the Australian Pastures Genebank. I do pre-breeding with the crop trust that we'll talk about today, and breeding as well. So if you like, my work goes right through from conservation of plant seeds through to development of new varieties and their commercialization.
Awesome. So let's start off with a little bit of background information for the audience. To start our conversation, can you please give a brief explanation of what wild relatives are and how they differ from those newer varieties?
Yeah, sure. So wild relatives are exactly that. They're plants that are from the wild, and they have evolved over millions of years to adapt to the environment that they live in. From a global perspective, there are many different types of adaptations to different conditions, and each population is unique. So when you consider plants collected from different areas in the world, they have evolved to adapt to that specific environment. And that's what makes them really useful for plant breeders. By contrast, so most new modern plant varieties are monocultures and often exact clones. So they're polar opposites. What I would say, though, is that it's been common over many years for plant breeders to introgress genes from wild plants, but usually for single genes for things like resistance to insects or fungal pathogens. But what's really changing now is that we're identifying broader groups of genes for things like adaptation, tolerance to salinity, drought, or heat stress.
Awesome. And why are these crop wild relatives so important for smallholder farmers in developing nations? And what role do forages play in helping these farmers?
Yeah, so I guess first I'd better just sort of define what a smallholder farmer is. They're typically, I guess, farming small parcels of land of less than, say, 10 hectares or 25 acres. I would include domestic farmers that have an off-farm income, or subsistence farmers that are really like survival orientated. So these smallholder farmers live in often developing nations and in marginal food production environments. So they've either been sort of pushed aside, or that's where they've historically lived. And because of either low income or poverty, they're often least equipped to deal with change. So crop wild relatives, they offer adaptation to these marginal food environments, these marginal production environments, and that's where they can play a role. But I guess what's interesting is that often these smallholder farmers are still producing food from crop wild relatives, and so they're helping to keep that diversity alive. And so there's really this co-benefit where they benefit each other.
Awesome. And you were the lead author on a prize-winning paper that described a research project that focused on harnessing drought-resistant traits in wild alfalfa plants. So can you tell me more about that project and your findings?
Yeah, okay. So as I mentioned before, I work for SARDI, but in this, it's part of the Crop Trust Bold program, which is funded by NORAD, which is part of the Norwegian government. So BOLD itself stands for biodiversity, for opportunities, livelihood, and development. And that's, yeah, lots of acronyms, but that's the BOLD acronyms are a fairly good one. That the whole project is about using biodiversity to support livelihoods for these smallholder farmers. So what we did in this project is we identified seeds of alfalfa or lucerne from global gene banks. They've been collected from all around the world, from the Arctic Circle to the hottest of Mediterranean environments. We grew out the seeds, characterized their diversity, tried to understand what makes them unique. And as part of that exercise, we also conserved them in the Australian Pastures Genebank here, as well as the Global Seed Vault at Svalbard in Norway. The second part of that was to evaluate them in partnership with smallholder farmers in Kazakhstan, China, and Chile, and to work out how these plants, with their diversity, could help smallholder farmers in these environments. We've had some pretty good successes. And the work continues today, and through the BOLD program actually has expanded to Pakistan and Kyrgyzstan.
That's fantastic. And as you reflect on that research and tying it all together, what are your main takeaways about why wild relatives are so crucial to plant breeding today?
Yeah, they are crucial because our climate is changing, and we can no longer rely on favourable weather conditions to produce food. So I think we need plants that are adapted to survive. They still need to produce food, but in tougher conditions. So that's the main sort of reason for that. And I guess this theory is backed up by the fact that when we grew this wild diversity, we made crosses with modern plant varieties, and the new hybrids that we created in this project actually created new diversity that we obviously hadn't seen before. So that's how they can be really useful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me, Alan, and I appreciate you hopping on.
Fantastic. Another big thank you to Alan for sharing that great information with us. So now let's get into some live questions I have for today. Barbara, I'm going to start out with you. I know Alan touched on this question, but I would love to continue the discussion. So why are wild relatives so important for plant breeding? Oh, I think you're on mute, Barbara.
Thank you. Yeah, like Ellen said, they're a source of genes for use in plant breeding for dealing with future stressors of our crop plants. So whether it's a drought or new fungal pathogens or new insects that are coming up, or in dealing with upcoming problems that we're going to have with climate change. So wild relatives are potential sources of genes for helping with adapting to those problems.
Pat, I would love to hear any additional thoughts you have on that question.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of background would be when our crop cultivars were first domesticated, it was only a very small percentage of plants that were selected by early farmers. Plants that had bigger seeds or maybe had seeds that stayed on the plant rather than being dispersed. And so a small amount of this diversity went into the crops that we grow, but this huge amount of diversity in the wild populations was left behind. So there's a lot of diversity that simply is not present in the cultivated germplasm.
Fantastic. And why is it important to preserve the genes of wild relatives for the future of breeding? And how do wild relatives help the world meet these challenges of global food security? And whoever wants to answer first.
Go ahead, Pat.
Well, I would just say that we are not sure what the needs of plant breeding are going to be in the future. You know, we have a changing climate. We have both extreme heat and extreme cold and floods and drought. We have new pathogen populations that are evolving. And so it's an insurance policy to have this reservoir of genes that breeders can select from. Now, we have good proof already that they've been very useful. As Alan said, a lot of single gene traits like disease resistance, insect resistance. But in the future, I think we're going to harness more of the adaptation traits as well. And traits, like I said, that we're not sure exactly what they're going to be, but by having an array of germplasm available, that helps us take advantage of that diversity.
And Barbara, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so just to give a couple of examples of how wild relatives have been used in the past. So the U.S. wild grape relative is used as a rootstock to provide resistance to phylloxera for cultivated grapes. In lettuce, the Lactuca cereola, which is prickly lettuce, it's common weed everywhere, but it has resistance to downy mildew, and that was used in breeding resistant varieties of head lettuce. And also another wild species of lettuce, Lactuca virosa. It's a biennial species. It's got a lot of latex in it. It wouldn't be good as a crop plant, but it provided resistance for lettuce aphid to cultivated lettuce. And sunflower, wild relatives have been used in sunflower breeding, and also walnut. One of the wild walnut species is used as a rootstock. So wild relatives, we have, as Pat said, we've utilized wild relatives in the past for plant breeding. And again, like he said, we don't know what we're going to be facing in the future. So they're part of our insurance policy for food security.
So clearly they're very important to plant breeding. So my next question is, what are the greatest threats to these wild relatives that experts are kind of seeing on the horizon that they need to start planning for or are even already combating? And Pat, I'll kick the question off to you first.
Well, there are so many threats. Changing climate has already been mentioned. So plant populations that have grown in certain environments are not able to grow there anymore. They're being affected by drought, by flooding, by extreme heat. Invasive populations are sometimes outcompeting these wild relatives. We have human threats, things like war in the Middle East. Just this week, earthquakes. so natural disasters. I had personal experience in Mexico. I worked for Summit in the maize program, and we were monitoring populations of the wild ancestor teosinte in western Mexico. We went back to a location where there was a thriving teosinte population 5 years previously. When we went back, there were cattle grazing. So, and we couldn't find a single teosinte plant. So, expansion of agriculture and urbanization is also a threat. And maybe Barbara would be able to add even more threats.
That's pretty much flood, fires, and like Pat said, agricultural practices, habitat loss, deforestation. That's happening a lot of places. Habitat fragmentation is also an important impact on wild relatives. Even though the species might be, you might still be able to find it in a certain location. If the population is too small, you're not going to get the mixing, the genetic mixing, in order to keep that population viable and able to change or adapt to future stressors. So that's an important one too, habitat fragmentation. Pat mentioned development. And that I've seen in a lot of the collections that I've done, development has been a big, it's wiped out many populations of wild relatives.
I'm actually going to take an audience question because I think that my next question kind of wraps up our discussion, but came in at the perfect time. This one is from Ashley Robinson. What plant breeding techniques are used with wild relatives, and are there any that react weirdly or don't work when working with wild relatives? And I know neither of y'all are necessarily plant breeders currently, but so if you feel that you can answer this, and if not, we can keep moving along.
Well, I could take a start at it. There are a lot of barriers and challenges to using wild relatives, sometimes purely biological. The crosses between a wild relative and a crop plant do not produce fertile offspring. Maybe the number of chromosomes is different in the two species. Maybe plants will, embryos will initially form, but are not able to mature to a ripe seed. So there's biological barriers of that type. There are also agronomic challenges in that wild relatives are very well adapted to their natural habitat, but don't have a lot of the traits that we're looking for in cultivar. So they're poor yielding, maybe the maturity is different, maybe the processing quality, like bread making quality, is not up to par. So there's a lot of things like that that have to be overcome. One of the things that has been done in response to the question is to use bridge species. So rather than making a direct cross between a wild relative and a crop plant, say like a wild relative of wheat and bread wheat, you would make an intermediate cross initially. That intermediate product would be more easily crossed to wheat than going directly from the wild to the cultivar. So there are some ways of getting around the challenges. I guess the use of DNA markers is a way that breeders can pinpoint more precisely what are the genes that they would like to bring in from the wild species, rather than crossing the whole genome, you would really focus on the few points that are going to be useful. So that's part of what's involved. It can get quite technical and detailed, but I think there are more and more ideas coming forward on how we can better utilize the wild species.
Great points, Pat. Barbara, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really, no. That Pat covered it all.
Awesome. And I'm going to let you, Barbara, kick off our final question of our discussion today. Tying into our previous question, what efforts or strategies are being put into place currently to help preserve those wild relatives so experts can keep utilizing them in the future?
So we've deployed for a long time. The National Plant Germplasm System has been collecting wild relatives in our ex situ collection. So we take them out of the wild and put them into our gene banks, where we manage them, and they're active collections. So they're not just sitting there in the gene bank. They're being utilized. They're being distributed to scientists worldwide and utilized. So that's ex situ conservation, but also in situ conservation has been deployed too. So in the U.S., there's wild grape in situ conservation sites, and also there's a chili pepper reserve down in the down on the Mexican border in Arizona. Also, there's been in situ conservation of cranberry populations in the U.S. And in Europe, there's also grape wild relative in situ projects being they've started those, and in the where wild relatives of wheat are in the past, there was a reserve set aside for wheat wild relatives in Turkey in that kind of a Fertile Crescent area. Ex situ conservation, that's the NPGS, and they're also in the U.S., and there's also world gene banks in Europe and in Asia, in South America and CIMAT, where Pat mentioned, in Mexico. For U.S. wild relatives, the Bureau of Land Management started a project they're calling Seeds of Success, and where they have collaborators and contractors collecting plant species all across the U.S. And so they're not focused on necessarily just on crop wild relatives, but their crop wild relatives are being collected in the Seeds of Success program. And those seeds, they're brought into the NPGS and distributed to researchers and for use in restoration, revegetation, and also basic science projects. Those are the basic ones that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Barbara. And Pat, I will give you the last word for this question.
For the same question that Barbara responded to just now?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I really don't think I have anything to add other than I think it's really the utilization of the germplasm that needs to happen now. I think the conservation community has done a very excellent job of conserving. Although there is more conservation and exploration to be done, but I think we have a really nice collection of materials. What really needs to happen is to find creative ways to use the wild germplasm, which will justify all of this effort that has gone into collecting and documenting and evaluating the germplasm. The final step is the hardest one, but I think it's going to happen, and it's starting to happen already.
Awesome, thank you. And if you look in the comment section, you will find a link to more resources if you're interested in learning more about efforts that are being made to protect and save wild relatives. And unfortunately, that is all the time we have today, everyone. Thank you so much to Barbara and Pat for joining me today. And thank you so much, Alan, again, for chatting with me prior to the stream. I hope everyone in the audience took home some fun knowledge because I know I did. If you like this topic, make sure to tune in next week where my colleague Ashley Robinson is talking about breeding for food intolerances. See you all then.